Hello and welcome to this next Flip Preaching video. My name's Andy. This week our passage we're going to look at is Matthew 18, 21 to 35, which follows on directly from last week, which was the story about forgiving other people and drawing people back in when they've gone off the rails and making sure that the community is as restored and as whole as it can be. And that idea of forgiveness runs through into today. There's a sheet which is available to print and the links below, which has got the text and some questions and some things to highlight. Okay, so it begins with Peter coming to Jesus and asking him, obviously something that was on his mind, how many times do I forgive someone who has sinned against me? So if somebody is causing you harm, how many times do you forgive them? And Peter says as many as 7 times. And Jesus says not 7, but 77, which is just a vast number. Kind of means infinity in that language. So right at the outset, we get this idea that forgiveness has to be unlimited. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't, if somebody's got a problem, it doesn't mean that we don't tackle a problem or help them to find healing of their own to stop the problem happening. But we've got to be ready to turn over a blank sheet of paper with people every time, indefinitely. And then there's a story which explains, it kind of explains it or adds another angle to it, a parable. And it's a really tricky one, actually, because it's a story of a king. It's a king who is incredibly wealthy, and it gives us a glimpse inside the inner workings of this king's, inner court. And the average peasants who would be hearing this wouldn't have any clue what's going on here. So perhaps for us, this would be like a conversation in number 10 Downing Street or the White House or wherever we are. So the people have the power. This is about their own internal power struggles. And straight away, when there's a parable with a king, we tend to assume, or perhaps you do, we tend to assume that the king represents God. But it doesn't have to. In quite a few of these parables, it's much better to read them without the king or the male figure at the centre representing God, because in this one, in some ways, the king is a bit like God, but in other ways, he really isn't. He's quite a nasty character. So let's go back to that 77 times, because that's really, really important. So Jesus says that we have to forgive people 77 times. And the number isn't random. It means infinite, but that 77 is a particular reference back to Genesis 4. Now, in Genesis 4, the Genesis story after Adam and Eve continues, and it doesn't go well, and Lamech is talking here, boasting to his wives about how he's going to avenge a wrong done to him. And it says 77-fold. So Lamech is saying, the damage done to me, I'm going to avenge. I'm going to get revenge 77 times. And Jesus, if you notice, says the same thing, but he completely inverts it. Whereas Lamech was about causing, if someone's done you harm, you go at them 77 times as much. Jesus says, no, you forgive them 77 times. Jesus completely redefines the Lamech story. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look at this story of the king. The king has a servant who he's kind of investigating, and the servant owes him, it says 10,000 talents. Now that was an absurd amount of money. It was just a crazy amount of money. Apparently 10,000 was the biggest number they had in those days. That's like their infinity. The talent was the biggest denomination of money that they had at the time. This was a vast amount of money. A historical document at the time says that all of Judea, the total tax revenue was for a year was 600 talents. And yet this guy owes 10,000 talents. It's just a ridiculous amount of money. And he says that he can't repay it, which may or may not be true. We don't know. If he was in this position, he probably should be able to. So the king orders that this man who owes him this money should be sold, together with his wife and his children and all of his possessions. And that is a terrible thing to happen. To be sold into slavery, that's not a good thing to happen. The most degrading thing that could have happened would be for him and his family and his wife and his children to be sold into slavery. And slavery wasn't a nice thing. That was, without me wanting to elaborate, you can imagine how grim that would be for a woman to be sold into slavery. So the man falls on his knees, says to the king, "Have patience with me." And out of pity, the king had grace and he forgave him this enormous debt. So in that bit there, we seem to have a measure of what God is like. This idea that God forgives an incredible amount. In Aramaic, the word debt and sin are the same word. So we can apply this to God forgiving sin in the same way. But then the story goes on. So this man, who'd risen up to the top of the tree in this king's sort of bureaucracy, probably wasn't a very good person. The way the king gets money is by exploiting other people and dragging up money from the poorest people and up the ladder. So this person is used to screwing money out of people. So he goes to somebody in exactly the same way as he did and tries to get a debt back from another fellow servant. And the debt here is 100 denarii, which is still a lot, but nowhere near the 10,000 talents. And this other person can't repay. Again, we don't know if that's true. So he has him thrown into prison until he can repay it. The king gets to hear about it. He calls this slave back and says, "You wicked slave, I forgave you this 10,000 talent debt, but yet you weren't prepared to forgive 100 denarii. So, and then in verse 34, which perhaps has been added on later, it says the king handed this man over to be tortured. That doesn't sound like God. It doesn't sound very Jewish. Torture wasn't allowed in Judaism instantly. Neither was selling people's wives. That was against the Jewish law. So this has probably been added in later. This probably wasn't in the original story. It wouldn't make sense if that was there. But the king hands this man over to be tortured until he can repay the debt. So I don't think it sounds much like God, to be honest, the king. Yes, he did forgive this vast debt, and that's kind of God's style, to forgive things. There's the story of the tradition of the Jubilee, where God encourages people to forgive everything. That's in God's character. But this thing about throwing you into prison, and I don't think that smacks of God at all. He doesn't forgive 77 times. The king forgives this man once, but he doesn't forgive him twice. He doesn't give him a second chance. And yet Jesus at the outset said, we've got to forgive 77 times, forgive again and again and again. So I think this story is, in a way, an illustration of how we fall short of God's standards. The king was along the right lines, perhaps, but he didn't go nearly far enough to be like God. God is more gracious than this king in every step. The passage from Exodus, which I've got here, is one of the foundational texts of the Jewish people. How God, he says, this is when the people were held captive in Egypt. They were slaves. I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings. I have come to deliver them. God is the person who delivers people from slavery. The king threatened this man with slavery and he threw him into prison. God is the person who frees people from prison. is very, very different. So the questions which I think could be a good thing to think about. So number one, what did you notice about Jesus' use of the number 77 in relation to the Genesis Lamech thing? Number two, count the ways in which the king in the parable is not like God, because just because he's a king and in the parable doesn't mean that he has to represent God. Sometimes the parables help us to show by contrast. And three, like that servant, do we fail to recognise the atmosphere of grace in which we live? The servant didn't react according to the grace that he had been shown. Are we guilty of the same? And four, how is this good news today? Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.